The book of Proverbs, Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Let's begin with some context. Now, when it comes to the context of the book of Proverbs, the literary and grammatical context are going to carry the most weight here. That said, there are some historical things worth pointing out. Now, this particular genre of literature, this collection of these wise sayings or proverbs, seems to be ubiquitous across the ancient Near East. We have examples of this type of literature from both Egypt and Mesopotamia, for example. And the basic assumption of this type of literature is that there are some underlying absolute principles to the universe and the way it works. And these principles transcend the subjective experience of humans, and in the case of the Babylonian and Egyptian literature, these principles even transcend the gods themselves. So the starting place for this literature is that there is an underlying truth to the universe. And in the case of the biblical book of Proverbs, this truth, or emet in Hebrew, is Yahweh himself, is the God of Israel, the one who created the universe in the first place. And knowing this truth and being able to act accordingly, in Hebrew it is what is called chachma, or wisdom. And not just in the biblical literature, but the other wisdom literature of the wider ancient Near East, the aspect of humanity that interacts with this underlying truth of the universe is the heart. In Hebrew, lev, what we would refer to in contemporary English as the mind, a human being's ability to think, reason, and most relevant to this literature, make choices. So that is to say, a wise person is one who acts in the world and makes choices based upon their knowledge of truth, or emet in Hebrew. That is to say, what is in line with objective reality. As a way to illustrate the significance of this concept within the minds of ancient people, you can just look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There you will find a scene of a deceased person being judged. To assess their eligibility for the afterlife, their heart would be weighed in a scale against the feather of truth, and if their heart was heavier or lighter than truth, they would be rejected. So the purpose of collecting proverbs within a book was so that one could study them, memorize them, contemplate them, and get them into the heart. So to use a contemporary metaphor, we can call it programming, whereas one is typically programmed by all the influences around you in your life, which then gives you a set of beliefs by which all of your actions in and perceptions of the world are filtered through. As an example of this, consider the way advertising works. For example, you may see a less than 1 minute ad before a video, and in that ad, the advertiser's goal is simply to, 1, elicit an emotion, and 2, associate that emotion with the product name or logo, or even just the color scheme of that product. And the idea is that after encountering that ad multiple times, you then become programmed with that association of that emotion with that product. So next time you're in the grocery store, saying buying toothpaste, for example, you'll see all the brands on the shelf, but the one that elicits that emotion will catch your eye, and you'll probably pick that one up and put it in your shopping basket. And then after the fact, you'll come up with reasons why you picked that one. And all of this takes place in the subconscious processes of the mind. You are unaware that this has happened. Now, ancient people have also made this observation about human behavior, that humans behave and make choices based upon their emotions, and they do so automatically in any given situation. So these ancient people noticed that you had the most amount of leverage for changing human behavior by changing the influences that are around that person. For example, look at Proverbs 13, verse 20. Whosoever walks with the wise will grow wise, and the companion of fools suffers harm. Furthermore, it is interesting to note that when it comes to human neurology, there is this phenomenon called neuroplasticity. As humans learn and adapt to new behaviors and new habits, the physical neurology of the brain actually changes. So by managing the programming or the influences in your life, you then in turn are managing your behavior. You can literally say you are rewiring your brain. So the purpose of a literary work like the Book of Proverbs is so that you can take it and program yourself so your perceptions of the world and your actions are in line with truth. That is to say, with objective reality. Now, in this literature, the way that these wise sayings or proverbs are collected and organized and presented are in the context of a wise king giving advice to the next generation. Or in the case of chapter 31, it's a wise mother giving advice to a son. Now, there's a lot more I can say about the concept of wisdom in the ancient world and the significance of this type of literature. But I think the context I've given so far will suffice to give us insight into the meaning of the couple of verses that we're going to look at. Now, the primary way ancient people would come in contact with the literature of the Bible is that they would hear it. So long before it was divided up into chapter and verse, it was broken up into sections meant to be read aloud before an audience. And one of these sections is Proverbs Chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. So we're going to briefly look at verses 1 through 10 to provide the context, and then we're going to zoom in and examine verses 5 and 6 a little more closely. Now, the setup for this particular section of Proverbs is that it is King Solomon giving advice to the next generation. And the significance of these proverbs being ascribed to King Solomon is that he is described in the biblical text as the wisest man that's ever lived. Now, here's how it appears in the English Standard Version. Let's begin. My son, do not forget my teachings, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, so that you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. So as you can see, these verses work in pairs. There's a verse that mentions something you should do, and then there's a verse that tells you what results from it. And all of these verses are all working in parallel. They're really just saying the same thing over and over again in different ways. So starting in verse 1, you can see the parallelism between do not forget and keep in your heart. These both mean the same thing. And teachings and commandments are also synonymous. Now, the Hebrew words behind teachings and commandments here are Torah and mitzvah, two words used to describe the Old Testament laws of the covenant that God made with Israel. In fact, Torah can even be used to describe the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. So by getting Torah in mitzvah into your heart or mind, this results in length of days, in years, in peace added to your life. The word there for peace is shalom. Now, shalom doesn't just mean peace as in not fighting. It means something more like well-being. It encompasses the whole person, so health and prosperity. Now, looking at verse 3, you can see the parallels there and how it parallels with verse 1. You have two things mentioned, steadfast love and faithfulness. The Hebrew words there are chesed and emet. Chesed is very difficult to translate into English, but it means something like covenant loyalty. So it's showing love by being loyal to the Torah and mitzvah of verse 1. And emet, that is our word for truth, for reality, the fundamental underlying principle of the universe. And the phrase, bind them around your neck and write them on the tablets of your heart, these two phrases both mean the same thing. Much like the phrase, do not forget, and to keep in the heart of verse 1. So just as putting Torah and mitzvah into your heart, or into your thought processes, into your subconscious mind, if you will, leads to shalom, in the next two verses, chesed and emet. Put those into your heart. Write them on the tablets of your heart, and it results in chen, or favor, grace. So if you imagine a fork in the road, one way leading to shalom, and the other way leading to a place that only ends in tears, the things you need to program yourself with to move you in the direction of shalom is the teachings, the commandments, the steadfast love, and the faithfulness of verses 1 and 3. So the Torah, the mitzvah, chesed, and emet. Put these things into your heart, and you will begin to move and perceive the world in such a way that you can go down that path towards shalom. Now, looking at verses 7 through 10, we see another two sets of pairs, following the same format of verses 1 through 4. In verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. So using our metaphor of a fork in the road, this means don't think you know better than the person who put the signs there pointing in the direction you should go. And he lists two things you should do. Fear Yahweh, so this is to be in awe of Yahweh, and turn away from evil. And the word there for evil is ra'ah, which in the Hebrew Bible is a way of describing the behavior of someone who sins. So when you do evil, you cause suffering to yourself and others. That is ra'ah. And it is also used for what God does when he judges someone for doing ra'ah. So someone does ra'ah, and God is just to bring ra'ah upon them. So move away from that and towards Yahweh, is what this verse is saying. So that's what it means to be in awe of Yahweh, or fear the Lord. And in verse 9, the instruction is to honor Yahweh with your wealth and with the first fruits of all of your produce. So the idea here is to show gratitude, to give him honor. To use our metaphor of the fork in the road, be grateful for the one who put the sign there to show you the way. And as you can see, all of these things result in shalom. In verse 8, it is healing, and in verse 10, it is prosperity. Now, if you will indulge me for a moment as I state the obvious, these verses aren't promises. These aren't mathematical formulas. And the reason I'm using the metaphor of a road is because these things indicate a direction that one is moving in with their decision-making. So you may be moving in the direction of shalom, but that does not mean you won't encounter tragedy and suffering along the way. But if you are moving in that direction, those things are just that, things along the way. Conversely, if you were moving in the opposite direction, the way of the fool, moving down a road that only ends in tears, the joy and happiness you might run into along the way will just be that, things along the way. So hopefully that was clear. Now, let's take a close look at verses 5 and 6. These two verses sit in the middle of our section here. And each of these verses is divided into two phrases, as indicated by the atna and the consecutive wa. So the first phrase, Betach el Yahweh bekol levekra. Betach is trust, but this is trust in the sense of security, feeling safe, and it is the opposite of insecurity, anxiety, worry. So it's trust as in confidence. Like we say in English, I got this. That's the idea here. So it's trust el Yahweh, on Yahweh, bekol levekra, with all your heart. Now in English, when we say all your heart, we mean something like with great devotion, or total commitment, or with gusto. This is not what's going on here. What this phrase is trying to say is something like, with all of your decision-making, rest secure on Yahweh. Now the next phrase, wa el binatka ol tisha'en, and on your understanding, not lean. And tisha'en can actually be translated trust as well, but it carries the idea of like leaning on a cane or a staff. You trust it to hold you up. And these two phrases constitute a parallelism typical of what you'd find in Hebrew poetry. You can see this by noting the use of synonyms. Notice the two words for trust. Betach in the first phrase, and tisha'in in the second phrase. Both can mean trust. And there are the two words levetkra in the first phrase and binetkra in the second phrase. These two are synonymous, the heart and understanding. For understanding is what the heart does. Just as eyes see, ears hear, the Hebrew understanding of the heart is that it understands, it comprehends, it thinks, makes choices. So you are to rest secure in Yahweh, not your own understanding. And the reason for this is quite simple. Your understanding of the world, if you are a mentally healthy person, is always changing. As you grow in knowledge, your understanding of the world will change, like a camera lens coming into focus. So the more truth that you have, the more that lens comes into focus and you can see the world as it really is. And you don't want to be trusting something that is always changing, just like you wouldn't want to lean upon a cane that is constantly changing length. It's not going to end well. So that's the meaning of these two phrases. Rest secure in Yahweh, not in your understanding of the world. And to use our metaphor of the fork in the road, you don't actually have to run down the road in each direction to see what's there. You can trust the sign, trust that Yahweh will point you in the right direction. Now, verse 6. Bekol darakika darihu. So this first phrase is something like, in all your ways, acknowledge him. Now this word daihu, acknowledge him, actually at its root it's yada, which means to know. This is the idea of experiential knowledge. So it's something like pay attention, know him, be aware of him when deciding which way to go. Now the second phrase of verse 6, Wahu yeyeshir orhot eka, and he will make straight or straighten out or make right your behavior or your path. And you can see that these two verses sit quite nicely in the middle of these first 10 verses of chapter 3. And they really underscore what you can call the theme of this entire section. So what does all this mean? These 10 verses, and what is underscored in verses 5 and 6, tell us that the wise sage of the book of Proverbs was trying to communicate to his audience that in order to make the correct decisions that move you in the direction of shalom and everything that goes along with it, one needs to rely upon and commit to one's heart the Torah, the mitzvah, the chesed, emet, that he's been talking about. So if you believe him and want to head down that path, maybe the first thing you need to do is find out what exactly those teachings and commandments are. Now, the same ideas that are communicated through these 10 verses here in Proverbs Chapter 3, actually you find all over the place in the literature of the Bible. In one such place it is particularly clear is Psalm 119, which is the longest chapter in the Bible. I'm not going to quote the whole thing here, but just note these couple verses. Verse 105, Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And there's verse 11, which sums all of this up quite nicely. Here it is in the New Living Translation, but more literally translated, it's something like, I have stored the things that you have said in my heart, so that I won't sin against you. Now let me wrap this up by returning to the metaphor of the fork in the road. So in order to head down the road that leads to shalom, you have to program your mind so that the behaviors that flow out of it result in you moving in that direction. But before you do that, there's a question that has to be answered. Before you decide upon a direction, you usually have to decide upon a destination. So the question for your contemplation, when it comes to your behavior and the influences you submit to that program you, where are you going?